Welcome to this channel. Before you watch this video, it's a good idea to press the subscribe, like, and share buttons with your friends so that this channel continues to grow. Thank you. I want to start by saying, I am not someone who scares easily. I have been hiking since I was 12 years old. I know how forests work. I know how animals move, how wind sounds, how branches fall. I have spent more nights alone in the woods than most people spend camping in their entire lives. So when I tell you that what happened to me on the Appalachian Trail last October changed the way I think about being alone in the wilderness, I need you to understand that I am not being dramatic. It started on day 3 of a solo section hike through western North Carolina. The weather had been perfect, cool and dry, on the kind of fall days that make you feel like the world was made just for you. I was moving at a good pace, maybe 14 miles a day, camping at designated sites and filtering water from streams. Everything was normal. Everything felt right. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Now I know that sounds strange because most people think forests are already quiet, but hikers know better. The woods are full of sound. Squirrels moving through leaves, birds calling back and forth, insects doing their thing. There is always something. But on the afternoon of day 3, around 4 in the evening, the forest just stopped. No birds, no squirrels, nothing moving in the trees above me. I slowed down and looked around, thinking maybe I had walked close to a predator, a bear, or a bobcat, something that made the other animals go still. And I did not see anything. After a few minutes, the sounds came back, and I kept walking. I set up camp before dark at a flat spot just off the trail. I made my food, hung my bear bag, and got into my tent. I was tired in the good way that hiking makes you tired, heavy in my legs, clear in my head. I fell asleep fast. I woke up at some point in the middle of the night. I did not know what woke me. There was no sound, no wind, nothing I could point to. I just opened my eyes and stared at the roof of my tent. And then I had this feeling, the kind of feeling that is hard to describe to someone who has not felt it. Like the air outside my tent was different than it had been before. Like something had changed while I was sleeping. I lay still for a long time, listening. I heard nothing. Eventually, I told myself it was just the forest, just my brain doing what brains do at 3 in the morning, and I went back to sleep. The next morning, I packed up and kept hiking. Around midday, I stopped at a water source to filter a couple of liters. While I was crouched down at the stream, I looked up the hill across from me, just casually looking around the way you do, and I saw something between the trees. It was still. It was tall. It was the rough shape of a person, but it was standing in a way that felt wrong. Slightly too far forward, like it was leaning toward me from a distance. I stared at it. It did not move. I told myself it was a dead tree, an old gray trunk catching the light in a weird way. I picked up my water and I left. But I walked faster after that. Without meaning to, I walked a lot faster. By the time I made it to the next shelter on the trail, my legs were tired and the sun was getting low. There were 2 other hikers already there, a couple from Tennessee who were doing the same section I was doing. I was so relieved to see other people that I almost laughed. We made food together and talked about the trail, about gear, about the weather coming in later that week. I did not tell them about what I saw at the stream. It already felt stupid in the company of other people, like a dream that loses its weight the moment you try to explain it out loud. That night, I slept in the shelter instead of my tent. It was a 3-sided wooden structure, open at the front, looking out into the dark tree line about 30 feet away. The couple fell asleep quickly. I lay in my sleeping bag and looked out at the trees. The moon was not very bright that night, and the forest in front of me was mostly black, just shapes and shadows. I was almost asleep when I noticed that one of the shadows at the edge of the tree line was shaped differently than the others. Taller, thinner. It was standing just at the place where the darkness of the forest met the slightly lighter dark of the open air around the shelter. I watched it for a long time. It did not move. I told myself it was a tree. I told myself my eyes were tired, and my brain was pulling shapes out of nothing the way brains do in the dark. I rolled over so my back was to the tree line, and I stared at the wooden wall of the shelter instead. It took me a long time to fall asleep, and I do not feel good about the fact that I turned my back to it. Even now, I do not feel good about that. Worse, in the morning, the couple packed up early and hiked out ahead of me. I took my time with breakfast, partly because I was tired, and partly because I did not want to admit I did not want to be alone on the trail again. When I finally started hiking, I kept checking behind me. Not every few minutes, more like every few seconds. The forest felt the same as it had the day before, normal at first, and then, after a few miles, too quiet again. That same heavy stillness. That same feeling of the air being different. Around noon, I stopped to eat a snack on a log just off the trail. I was sitting there looking down at my food when I heard something in the leaves uphill from me. A slow and heavy sound, like something large shifting its weight. I looked up. I could not see anything moving, but the sound was there. Deliberate, patient. I sat very still and listened. It stopped. I waited another full minute, and then I stood up, packed my snack away, and started walking again. The sound started again, about 10 seconds after I started moving, coming from the same direction, uphill and parallel to the trail, keeping pace with me. I stopped walking. The sound stopped. I started walking. The sound started. I did this 3 times before I made myself stop testing it, because I realized that some part of me did not want to know for certain. As long as I could pretend it was a deer or a bear moving through the brush, I could keep walking. So I kept walking. I did not look uphill again. I just looked at the trail in front of me, and I moved as fast as I could without running. Because something in my gut told me very clearly that running would be the wrong thing to do. I made it to a road crossing by mid-afternoon, and I sat down on the guardrail and just breathed for a while. There is something about seeing asphalt that calms you down when you have been in the woods for days. It feels like proof that the normal world still exists. I drank some water and ate a handful of crackers and told myself I was done being scared. I told myself the sound in the trees was a deer. I told myself the shapes I had seen were trees and shadows and tired eyes. I had 2 more days on this section, and I was going to finish it. I crossed the road and went back into the forest. The afternoon was fine. The trail climbed a long ridge, and the views opened up, and I could see for miles in every direction. Rolling blue hills going all the way to the horizon. It is hard to feel afraid when you can see that far. I felt like myself again. I made good miles and found a campsite just before dark, a small flat area tucked behind a cluster of large boulders, which felt protected in a way that I liked. I set up my tent, made my food, and watched the sky go dark. I was washing my spoon at a small water source near the camp when I found the boot print. It was in the soft mud at the edge of the water. A full boot print, deep and clear, pointing toward my campsite. It was fresh enough that the edges had not dried out yet, which meant it had been made sometime that afternoon, probably within the last few hours. I looked around. I had not seen another hiker all day. The print was larger than mine. I stood there looking at it for longer than I should have. And then I went back to my tent and zipped it up completely and sat inside it in the dark. I told myself that other hikers use this water source. I told myself someone had passed through while I was setting up camp, and I had simply not noticed them. I told myself these things over and over while I sat in my tent listening to the forest outside. The forest was quiet. That same deep quiet that I had learned over the past few days meant something, though I still could not tell myself clearly what it meant. I did not sleep much that night. Every few hours I would drift off and then come back awake suddenly, completely awake, the way you get when your body is trying to tell you something your brain does not want to hear. Each time I woke up, I would lie completely still and listen. I heard nothing. But the feeling was there. That same feeling from the first night. Like the air outside my tent was occupied. Like something was nearby that had not been nearby before. At some point, very late in the night, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard breathing. It was slow and steady, and it was coming from just outside my tent, maybe 3 or 4 feet away, on the other side of the thin nylon wall. I lay completely still. I stopped breathing myself so I could hear it better. It was real. It was not wind. It was not my own breathing echoing back to me. It was slow and deliberate and patient. The breathing of something that was not in any hurry at all. It went on for what felt like a very long time, and then it stopped, and the forest stayed quiet. And I lay there until the sky outside my tent started to go gray with the first light of morning. And then I packed my things as fast as I've ever packed anything in my life. And I walked out to the nearest road, and I called someone to come get me. I did not finish the section. I told people it was because of the weather coming in. I have not hiked alone since then. I still think about the breathing. I think about how slow it was. I think about how it did not sound afraid of me at all. A few weeks after I got home, I started looking things up online. I told myself I was just curious. I searched for missing persons cases on the Appalachian Trail, strange encounters, that kind of thing. I found a lot of the usual stuff. People getting lost, weather emergencies, a few sad cases that made the news over the years. But then I found a forum post from someone who had hiked the same section of North Carolina Trail about a year before me. The post was short. The person said they had cut their trip short because they felt like they were being followed for 2 straight days. They said they never saw anything clearly. They said the worst part was the quiet, the way the forest would just stop making noise for long stretches, and they did not know how to explain that to people who had not experienced it. The post had 4 replies. 3 of them were people telling the hiker they had probably just been spooked by a bear. The 4th reply was from an account with no other posts, no profile picture, no information at all. It said, and I am going to write this exactly as it appeared: do not go back to that section alone. Some things on that trail are not animals, and they are not people either. They follow because they are curious. The problem is when they stop being curious. The account had not posted anything else. Ever. I clicked on the profile, and it had been created the same day as that reply, and never used again. I know how that sounds. I know that the internet is full of people who say strange things for no reason, who create accounts just to leave one weird comment and disappear. I know that. But I sat with that reply for a long time. Because the word it used was the same word I had been using in my own head, without realizing it. Curious. That was exactly what the breathing outside my tent had felt like. Not threatening, not angry. Patient and slow and curious. Like something that had found an interesting thing and wanted to stay close to it for a while. That thought did not make me feel better. It made me feel worse, because if it had been curious that night outside my tent, then it had been following me for days before that, watching me set up camp and make food and filter water and do all the small, ordinary things a person does on a long hike. It had been learning me, and I had no way of knowing whether it had learned enough and moved on, or whether it had followed me all the way to that road crossing and watched me get into a car and drive away. I moved to a new apartment about 2 months after the hike. I told myself it was for practical reasons, closer to work, cheaper rent. Both of those things were true. But I also want to be honest, because the whole point of writing this out is to be honest about what happened and how it made me feel. The real reason I moved is that my old apartment was on the ground floor, and it had a lot of trees behind it, culverts, and in the weeks after I got home from the trail, I started having the feeling again. That same feeling. The air outside being different at night. That sense of something nearby that was not in any hurry. I never heard breathing again. I want to be clear about that. I never saw a shape in the trees behind my old apartment. It was just a feeling, and feelings can lie to you. And I am aware that what I went through on that trail was the kind of experience that can make a person see things that are not there for a long time afterward. But I sleep better in the new apartment. It is on the 4th floor, and there are no trees close to the windows, and the city noise is loud enough that the silence never gets too deep. And that is all I am going to say about that. I still love hiking. I want to be clear about that too. And I went out with a group of friends last spring and had a wonderful time and felt completely fine. But I have not gone alone again. I do not think I will for a long time. There is a particular kind of alone that exists deep in a trail like that. Miles from any road, in the dark with nothing between you and the forest but a thin piece of nylon. I used to love that feeling. It made me feel free. I do not love it anymore. Now it just makes me think about how small I am and how patient some things can be, and how little I actually know about what shares those woods with us when we go walking through them thinking we are by ourselves. I did not plan on telling this story publicly. I wrote it out in a notes app on my phone about 6 months after it happened, just for myself, where the way you sometimes need to put something into words to get it out of your chest. It sat there for almost a year before I decided to post it. The reason I finally did is because of something that happened last month that I have not told anyone yet. I was at work, sitting at my desk, doing nothing more interesting than answering emails, when I got a message through an old hiking forum account I had almost forgotten I had. The account is connected to an email I barely check anymore. The message was from a username I did not recognize. It had no greeting. It just said, "You hiked the North Carolina section in October 2 years ago. Solo. You camped behind the boulders near mile marker 14. I was camped about half a mile south of you that night. I heard something outside my tent too. I have been trying to find other people from that week on that section ever since. Please contact me if you are comfortable doing so." I stared at that message for a long time. On one hand, it is completely possible that this was another hiker who had a scary night in the same area around the same time and has been looking for someone to compare notes with. That is the simple explanation, and it is probably the right one. Scary nights in the woods are not rare. The Appalachian Trail is long and old and full of strange stories, and most of them have ordinary explanations that just feel extraordinary because of the dark and the isolation and the way fear works on a tired brain. On the other hand, I had never posted about this experience anywhere before. My old forum account had no posts connecting me to that section of trail or that time of year. I do not know how this person found me or how they knew I had been there. I have not been able to figure that out no matter how many times I go back and look at my old posts and profile information. I did not reply to the message. I know that might seem cold, and part of me feels bad about it, especially if that person is genuinely just another hiker looking for someone who understands what they went through. But something about the specificity of it bothered me deeply. The boulders, the mile marker, the fact that whoever sent it knew I had been solo. I do not remember posting any of that information anywhere. It is possible I did and forgot. It is possible there is a completely normal explanation for how they knew. I closed the message, and I have not opened it again. A few days later, I tried to go back to it, and the account that sent it had been deleted. The message was still in my inbox, but the sender no longer existed on the platform. I took a screenshot of it. I do not know why. It felt important to have proof that it was real, that I had not imagined it. I look at that screenshot sometimes. Just the words sitting there on a white background, plain and simple and specific. You camped behind the boulders near mile marker 14. I look at it and I think about the breathing outside my tent that night. Slow and patient and curious. I think about that forum reply telling me that some things follow because they are curious. And the problem is when they stop being curious. I think about how I have been telling myself for 2 years that I am fine, that it was just a bad night in the woods, that the world is ordinary and explainable and nothing reached out from those dark Carolina hills and took a lasting interest in me. I think about all of that, and then I put my phone down and I go make coffee, and I look out my 4th floor window at the street below where people are walking dogs and riding bikes and doing all the normal things people do in the daylight. And I remind myself that I am fine, that I am safe, that whatever was on that trail stayed on that trail. I almost believe it most days. But some mornings, I wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning for no reason I can name, completely awake, the way you get when your body's trying to tell you something. And I lie still and I listen to the city outside my window. And the city is always there, loud and alive and ordinary, except for the nights when, just for a moment, it goes quiet. Too quiet. And the air in my room feels different than it did before I fell asleep. On those nights, I do not get up to check. I just lie there and wait for the morning, and I think about how patient some things can be, and how far a curious thing might be willing to travel, and how a 4th floor window probably means nothing at all to something that has been walking those hills since long before any trail was ever cut through them. I have not heard the breathing again, but I think that is the part that scares me the most. Next story. I want to be upfront about something before I start. I am a pretty skeptical person by nature. I do not believe in ghosts. I do not watch paranormal videos online and take them seriously. I studied biology in college, and I spent a lot of time learning how nature actually works, how animals behave, how ecosystems function. I say all of this because I want you to understand the kind of person I am. Before I tell you what happened to me and my friend Derek in the Appalachian woods 3 summers ago. Because if someone had told me this story before it happened to me, I probably would have smiled and nodded and privately assumed they were exaggerating. I am not exaggerating. Derek and I had been planning the trip for almost a year. We were not doing the full trail, but just a week-long camping trip deep in a section of forest in Western Virginia, well off any marked trail, the kind of place where you do not see other people, and the trees are so thick that the light on the ground looks green in the middle of the day. We had done trips like this before. We knew what we were doing. We packed well, we told people where we were going, we brought a satellite communicator for emergencies. We were responsible about it. The drive out was easy, and the first day of hiking in was beautiful. The forest in late July is dense and loud with life. Insects everywhere, birds moving through the canopy, the occasional crash of something large moving through the brush in the distance. We set up camp on the second day near a wide, shallow creek, a good spot with flat ground and easy access to water. Everything felt right. Not that we made a fire that night and talked for hours and went to sleep feeling genuinely happy to be out there. The first thing that felt off happened on the morning of day 3. I woke up before Derek and went down to the creek to wash my face and get water for coffee. The creek was maybe 40 feet from our tents, through a short stretch of trees. I was crouched at the water filling a pot when I noticed the mud on the opposite bank. It was churned up, heavily disturbed, like something had been standing there for a long time in one spot. Not a single print I could read clearly, more like the mud had been worked and reworked, pressed down and shifted again and again. Whatever made it had been standing on that bank for a while, shifting its weight slowly just across the water from our campsite. The creek was narrow enough that I could have thrown a rock across it without much effort. I looked at that mud for a while. Then I filled my pot and went back to camp and made coffee, and did not say anything to Derek about it. I think I was already doing the thing where you decide not to give a strange thing too much importance, because you do not want to be the person who ruins a good trip over nothing. I have thought about that decision a lot since then. I wonder sometimes how the rest of the week would have gone if I had just said, "Hey, come look at this. Does this seem weird to you?" But I did not. I handed Derek his coffee, and we talked about where we wanted to hike that day, and the mud on the other bank dried out in the morning sun, and by afternoon I had almost stopped thinking about it. Almost. We hiked about 8 miles that day, looping through the forest and coming back to camp from the north side. It was a good day, hard enough to feel satisfying, with a long climb in the middle that opened up into a rocky overlook where we sat and ate lunch and looked out over miles of unbroken forest below us. From up there, the woods looked peaceful and still. Just an endless green canopy rolling over the hills in every direction. It is funny how different a place can feel depending on where you are standing inside it versus looking at it from above. We got back to camp around 4 in the afternoon. Derek went to the creek to filter water, and I started setting up for dinner. I was digging through my food bag when Derek called out from the direction of the creek, not loud, just a normal voice. On the kind you use when you want someone to come look at something without making a big deal of it yet. I walked down to where he was standing at the water's edge. He was looking at the opposite bank. The mud was disturbed again. Fresh this time, clearly fresh. The edges of the impression still soft and dark with moisture. And this time there was something else. A line of broken branches along the bank. Low ones, the kind that grow sideways out over the water. 3 of them snapped cleanly and laid on the ground in a rough row, parallel to the creek, not scattered the way a falling tree or a clumsy animal might leave them. Parallel. Laid out with a kind of rough order that made my stomach feel cold in a way I did not immediately want to acknowledge. Derek looked at me, and I looked at him. He said it was probably a bear. I said probably. We both stood there for a moment longer than we needed to, if we actually believed it was a bear. Then we went back to camp and made dinner and built the fire up higher than usual and sat close to it while the light died out around us. That night was the first night I heard the sound. It started late, well after midnight, after we had put the fire out and gotten into our tents. It was a low sound, not loud at all, coming from the trees on the far side of the creek. The best way I can describe it is a slow and rhythmic exhalation, like a very large thing breathing out through its nose, long and steady, over and over. It was not fast enough to be an animal that had been running. It was the breathing of something completely calm and still, on something that was just standing in the dark across the water and breathing slowly in the direction of our camp. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to it for a long time. I told myself it was a bear. Bears make sounds at night. Bears move around and breathe and do bear things in the dark. The sound was consistent with a large animal. I ran through all of these explanations carefully and deliberately inside my head, the way you do when you are trying to use logic to push down something your gut is already certain about. My gut was not buying it. The breathing went on for what felt like 30 minutes. Then it stopped. The forest went very quiet after it stopped. That deep, specific quiet I would come to recognize over the next few days as its own kind of warning. I lay awake for a long time after that. And at some point I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was gray morning light and birds were starting up in the trees, and Derek was unzipping his tent and asking if I wanted oatmeal. I asked him if he had heard anything in the night. He was quiet for a second, and then he said he had heard something, but was not sure what it was. He said it had woken him up, but he had not wanted to make a big deal of it. We looked at each other over our camp stoves, and both understood without saying it directly that we had heard the same thing. We ate our oatmeal and talked about the weather, and neither of us suggested leaving. I think we were both still at the stage where we wanted very badly to believe in the simple explanation. The simple explanation got harder to hold on to that afternoon. We had split up for a couple of hours, something we occasionally did when one of us wanted to sit and read and the other wanted to keep moving. Derek stayed at camp, and I did a short solo loop through the trees to the east, maybe 2 miles out and back. I was on my way back, maybe half a mile from camp, moving through a dense section of forest where the trees grew close together and the undergrowth was thick on both sides of my path, when I got the feeling. It is hard to explain the feeling to someone who has not had it in that specific context. It is not exactly fear. It is more like a sudden and total certainty that you are not alone, a certainty that arrives all at once without any single piece of evidence you can point to, coming up from somewhere below conscious thought. Every part of my body got very still and very alert at the same moment. I stopped walking. I stood in the middle of the path and listened. The forest around me was quiet. Not the natural quiet of a calm afternoon, but that other quiet, the heavy kind, the kind where even the insects have stopped. I turned around slowly and looked behind me. Nothing. Just trees and shadow and the path I had come down. I stood there for a long time, turning in a slow circle, looking into the trees in every direction. I saw nothing moving. I heard nothing. But something was there. I knew it the way you sometimes just know things, deep and certain and not up for debate. Something was standing in those trees watching me, close enough that I should have been able to see it if I looked in the right direction, and I could not find it no matter where I looked. I walked back to camp at a pace just below a run, and I did not look behind me once. I did not tell Derek what happened on the path. I sat down at camp and drank some water and waited for my heart to slow down, and by the time it did, I had already started talking myself out of it again. The feeling in the woods, that deep, certain feeling of being watched. I had almost convinced myself it was just the product of a tired brain and too many hours alone in a quiet forest. People feel watched all the time for no reason. It is a survival instinct left over from a time when the feeling actually meant something. It does not always mean something now. That is what I told myself. Derek was in a good mood that evening. He had spent the afternoon reading and napping and felt rested and relaxed. And his mood was contagious enough that I started to feel better too. We made a good dinner. Something with pasta and olive oil and a lot of garlic. and the smell of it filled the camp and made everything feel ordinary and warm. We built the fire up and stayed out later than the nights before, talking about nothing important, the way you do when you are comfortable with someone and the night is warm and the stars are out. It was a good night. I want to say that clearly because what came after, it was not good, and I do not want the whole trip to sound like nothing but dread, because it was not. There were genuinely beautiful and peaceful hours out there. The woods in the morning with coffee, the overlook at lunch, that fire on the third night. Those things were real too. We went to bed a little after midnight. I fell asleep faster than the night before, us worn down enough by the hiking and the fresh air that my body won out over my brain. I slept hard for what felt like several hours. Then I woke up. There was no sound that woke me this time. No breathing from across the creek. Just that same total wakefulness, arriving all at once, my eyes open and my body completely still, before I had even consciously decided to be still. I lay in my sleeping bag and looked up at the roof of my tent and listened. The forest was silent. Then, very slowly, I became aware of a smell. It came in through the mesh vents at the top of my tent, faint at first and then stronger. It was a heavy, damp smell, something between wet earth and something else I could not name. Something animal and old and deeply unpleasant. Not like a skunk, nothing sharp or chemical. More like something that had been wet for a very long time and had started to change because of it. I have tried many times to find the right words for that smell, and I have never fully managed it. The closest I can get is to say it smelled like something alive that had no business being alive. It was strong enough that I pulled my sleeping bag up over my nose. I breathed through the fabric and lay completely still and listened. Nothing moved outside my tent. There was no sound at all, but the smell stayed, heavy and close, the way a smell gets when its source is very near rather than carried on the wind from a distance. Whatever it was coming from was not far away. I do not know how long I lay there. Long enough that my legs started to ache from being held so still. At some point, the smell began to fade, slowly, and the way it would if whatever was producing it had begun moving away. It faded until it was gone, and the air coming through the vents smelled like normal forest air again, cool and clean and green. A few minutes after the smell was completely gone, the insects started up again, quietly at first and then at their normal volume, and the creek made its water sounds, and the forest sounded like a forest again. I did not sleep after that. In the morning, I crawled out of my tent and looked at the ground around it carefully. The soil near our camp was soft in places, especially on the north side where the shade kept it from drying out completely. On that side of my tent, about 4 feet from the entrance, I found a depression in the soil. It was not a clean print. It was not something I could photograph and show someone and have them say, yes, that is clearly a footprint from a specific animal. It was just a large depression, oval-shaped, deep enough that whatever made it had been heavy, pressed into the soft ground at a depth that made me think of weight and size rather than the light step of a deer or the wide, flat impression of a bear paw. I stared at it for a long time. And then I got the camp stove going and made coffee. And when Derek emerged from his tent, I handed him a cup and said, very carefully, that I thought maybe we should talk about whether we wanted to stay the full week. Derek looked at me over his coffee. He asked me why. I told him about the smell. I told him about the depression in the soil. I watched his face while I talked, and I could see him doing the same thing I had been doing for 3 days, weighing the simple explanation against the feeling. I was trying to decide which one to trust. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he told me that the night before while I had been asleep. He had gotten up to use the bathroom at the edge of camp and had seen something at the tree line. He said it was dark and he could not be certain of what he was looking at. But he said there was a shape at the edge of the trees that was too tall and too still to be something casual, and that it had been facing the camp, and that he had gone back to his tent and not said anything because he had not wanted to scare me. We looked at each other across our camp stoves. We did not leave that morning. I wish I could explain why. Part of it was stubbornness, not wanting to be the people who hiked out early because of bad smells and shapes in the dark. Part of it was that in the daylight, with coffee in our hands and birds moving in the trees above us, the whole thing felt just far enough away to be manageable. And part of it, the part I am least proud of, was that we were already talking ourselves into staying before either of us had consciously decided to, the way people do when they want a particular outcome badly enough. We stayed. We told ourselves we would pay more attention. We told ourselves we would be smart about it. We spent most of day 4 close to camp. Neither of us said that out loud as a decision. It just happened naturally, the way 2 people can agree on something without actually discussing it. Derek organized his gear and did some reading. I spent time walking the perimeter of our campsite slowly, looking at the ground, looking at the trees, or trying to understand the geography of the place we had been sleeping in for 4 nights. I told myself I was just being observant. Really, I was trying to figure out where something would stand if it wanted to watch our camp without being seen. The answer was uncomfortable. The forest around our site had several spots where the trees and undergrowth were dense enough to hide something large at a distance of 30 or 40 feet. On the north side, where the soft soil was, the tree line came closest to our tents. On the creek side, the sight lines were more open, but the sound of the water would cover any noise from that direction. Whoever had chosen this campsite, which was us, had chosen a place that felt sheltered and protected. Looking at it now, I understood that sheltered and protected also meant surrounded, and I did not share this thought with Derek. I went back to camp and made lunch, and we talked about normal things, and the afternoon passed quietly. Too quietly, actually. We both noticed without mentioning it that the birds were less active than they had been on previous days. Not silent the way the forest got at night, just reduced, like the volume on something had been turned down a little. Small enough to explain away, not small enough to ignore completely once you had already started paying attention. We made dinner early and kept the fire going strong. We had not talked explicitly about being scared, but we had both gravitated toward the fire the way people do when the alternative is sitting in the dark. The fire felt like a boundary, a circle of light that the darkness outside had to respect. I know that is not how fires actually work, but that is how it felt. And I think Derek felt it too, because he kept adding wood long after we would normally have let it die down. Around 9 in the evening, Derek suddenly went very still. I looked at him, and his eyes were focused on the tree line across the creek. I looked in the same direction. At first, I saw nothing, just the darkness between the trunks, the faint reflection of our firelight on the surface of the water. Then I saw what he was looking at. There was a shape at the edge of the tree line on the far bank. It was in the shadow between 2 large trees, which made it hard to look at directly. The kind of thing that seems clearer in your peripheral vision than when you look straight at it. It was tall, noticeably tall, and it was not moving at all. It was just standing there, angled slightly in the direction of our fire. In that particular way that something stands when it is looking at something with focus and patience and no intention of moving anytime soon. We sat very still. The fire crackled between us, and the shape in the creek moved quietly, and nothing else happened for a long time. Derek reached over slowly and put his hand on my arm, not grabbing, just resting his hand there. The way you reach for someone when you need to confirm that another person is real and present, and you are not alone. I did not move. I kept my eyes on the shape between the trees. It was there for a long time, long enough that I started to doubt myself, started to wonder if I was looking at a tree trunk or a shadow playing tricks in the firelight. And then it moved. Not a lot, not in any dramatic way. It shifted its weight slowly, the way a person shifts their weight when they have been standing in one spot for too long and one leg is getting tired. A slow lean to one side, just a few inches, and then still again. That was all. But that small, slow movement was the most frightening thing I have ever seen in my life, because it was so familiar. It was such a human thing to do. And it was standing across the creek from our camp at 9 at night, and it was not a human. Derek stood up. He did it slowly and deliberately, and he picked up the long stick he had been using to manage the fire. He held it in a way that was not aggressive, but was not casual either. He spoke in a normal conversational voice, not loud, just clear and even, and he said that we could see it and that it needed to move along now. Nothing happened for a moment, and then the shape was gone. Not quickly, not in a way we could track with our eyes. One moment it was there, and the next moment the space between those two trees was just shadow and bark and nothing else. We stood at the edge of our firelight and stared at the place where it had been for a long time. I asked Derek if he wanted to leave. He said yes. I said we should wait until morning because packing up a camp in the dark and hiking out through an unlit forest felt like the worst option. He agreed. We fed the fire until we had no more wood to give it. We sat with our backs to each other, so we were both facing outward in opposite directions. We did not sleep. We watched the tree line on every side of our camp until the sky started to go pale and the birds came back, cautiously at first, one or two and then more, or until the forest sounded like itself again. We packed up in the early morning light, and we were on the trail back out before 7. We hiked fast and did not stop for breaks, and we did not talk much. At some point in the middle of the morning, Derek said, without looking at me, that he did not think it had meant to let us see it that night. He said he thought it had just been standing there long enough that it forgot to be careful. I have thought about that a lot. The idea that it had been careful before. That all the nights before the last one, all the breathing and the smell and the feeling of being watched on the path, it had been doing those things carefully. Keeping itself at the edge of what we could be certain about, staying in the space between explainable and not, never quite giving us something solid enough to act on. And then, on the last night, it shifted its weight, and we saw it move, and it remembered itself and stepped back into the dark. I think Derek is right. I think it forgot to be careful for just a moment. And I think about what that means, about how many other moments there must have been when it was perfectly careful, and we never knew it was there at all. On the overlook at lunch. On the path when I felt watched and could not find it. In the dark outside my tent, with the smell coming through the vents. I think about how long it had been watching us before we ever noticed it. I think about how good it was at not being seen. We made it back to the trailhead by early afternoon. When we got to Derek's truck, we both just stood there for a minute, not talking, looking at the tree line at the edge of the parking area, and the forest looked completely normal from there. Sunlight on the leaves, a light breeze moving through the upper branches, a couple of squirrels chasing each other along a fallen log near the tree line. Just a forest. Just a regular stretch of Appalachian woods on a warm July afternoon. The kind of place people bring their families on weekends. The kind of place that looks absolutely harmless when you're standing at its edge in the daylight, with a parking lot behind you and car keys in your hand. We threw our packs in the back of the truck and drove to the first town we came to, a small place with a diner on the main street. And we sat in a booth and ordered the kind of food you crave after a week of hiking, eggs and toast and coffee and bacon. And we ate without talking much. The diner was warm and bright and full of the sounds of other people, dishes and conversations, and a television in the corner showing a morning news program. I sat in that booth and felt the specific relief of being surrounded by ordinary human noise. And I understood for the first time in my life why people used to build fires and sleep in groups and put walls between themselves and the dark. After we ate, Derek asked me what I thought it was. I told him honestly that I did not know. I went through the list the way I had been going through it in my head for days. Bear, obviously, was the first candidate. But bears do not stand at the edge of tree lines, watching campsites for hours at a time. And bears do not shift their weight with that slow, patient human quality. And bears do not disappear between one moment and the next without any sound of movement through the undergrowth. Large predator of some kind, maybe something we did not have a name for. But that felt like the kind of explanation that just pushed the question back one step rather than actually answering it. A person, possibly some disturbed individual living out in those woods. Which is maybe the most frightening explanation of all, because a person could follow us. A person would know how to find us again. Derek listened to all of this, and then he was quiet for a while. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and looked out the window at the street outside. And then he said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. He said that whatever it was, Mavat, the thing that bothered him most was not the size of it or the shape of it or even the way it moved. The thing that bothered him most was how long it had been there before we noticed it. He said we had been in that camp for 4 days before we got our first real indication that something was watching us. 4 days of eating and sleeping and moving around and living our ordinary camp life, completely unaware. And the only reason we ever found out at all was because of a disturbance in some mud, and a smell through a tent vent, and one moment of carelessness at a fire on the last night. He said, what if we had not noticed the mud? What if I had not woken up and smelled that smell? What if it had stayed careful on the last night, the way it had stayed careful on every other night? We would have hiked out at the end of our week feeling like we had a great trip, a little tired, a little sunburned, happy and full of good memories. We would never have known. And then he said the part that really got to me. He said, how many other trips? I put my coffee cup down. I looked at him across the table. He looked back at me with an expression I recognized because I'd been wearing it for 4 days. That specific look of someone who is trying to stay on the rational side of a line that keeps moving further away from them. How many other trips? I have been camping since I was a child. Dozens of nights in the woods over the course of my life, in different states, different forests, different seasons. All those nights in a tent with nothing but thin nylon between me and whatever was outside. Like all those mornings when I woke up feeling fine and well-rested and walked out of my tent into a normal, peaceful forest morning and never once thought to check the soft soil around my campsite for depressions, never once thought to pay attention to whether the smell of the air through my tent vents was different at 2 a.m. than it was at midnight. I have not gone back to that section of Virginia. Derek and I have talked about it a few times since then, and we have not been able to agree on what we experienced, not because we disagree about what we saw and heard. We both know what we saw and heard, but because neither of us has a framework for it that we are fully comfortable with. Every explanation we land on has a problem with it. Every tidy answer falls apart somewhere. What I keep coming back to is the patience of it. Whatever it was extraordinarily patient. It did not rush. It did not escalate. It stayed at the edge of what we could confirm for days, moving carefully, controlling how much of itself it allowed us to perceive. That kind of patience implies something. It implies experience. It implies that it had done this before, with other people, in other camps, and had learned over time exactly how close it could get, and exactly how much it could reveal before the people it was watching started making decisions that would end in the watching. It almost got the calibration right with us. It was off by just one small moment at a fire on night 4. One slow shift of weight. One brief lapse in 4 days of careful and practiced restraint. I think about the people who camped in those woods before us and never had that one moment. Who hiked out healthy and happy and completely unaware. I think about whether the thing we saw is still out there, somewhere in that stretch of Virginia forest, watching the next group of people who set up camp near that creek, learning their rhythms, memorizing their routines, standing in the dark at the edge of their firelight, perfectly still, patient as something that has all the time in the world. I think about all of that, and then I try to think about something else. It does not always work. Last week I got a call from a friend who is planning a camping trip in Western Virginia this fall and wanted to know if Derek and I wanted to come along. I told her we were probably not available that weekend. She asked if we had been to that area before, and I said yes, once, a few summers ago. She asked if it was worth visiting. She said she had heard the forest out there was really beautiful. I told her it was, because it is. That is the thing I keep coming back to. The thing that makes all of this so hard to file away neatly and forget about. It was genuinely beautiful out there. The light through the trees in the morning, the sound of the creek at night, the overlook at lunch with the whole green world spread out below us. All of that was real and true and good. It is just that something else was real and true out there too. Something patient and large and careful that has been living in those hills for a long time. Longer probably than any trail or campsite or parking lot at a trailhead. Longer than any of the names we have given to those mountains or any of the maps we have made of them. Something that watches the people who come walking into its forest with their bright gear and their bear bags and their satellite communicators, all their careful preparations for every danger they thought to prepare for. Something that knows, from long experience, that it is not on any of the lists. About 4 months after the trip, I did something that I had been avoiding doing. I sat down at my laptop and spent a serious amount of time searching for any documented accounts of unusual activity in that specific area of Virginia forest. I had avoided doing it before because I think I was afraid of 2 equally uncomfortable outcomes. Either I would find nothing, which would leave me alone with an experience that had no context or corroboration, or I would find something, and which would mean the thing we encountered was real and documented, and other people had been through it too. I found something. It took a while to get there. Most of the early search results were the usual outdoor forums, trip reports, gear recommendations, trail conditions. Normal stuff. I went deeper, searched more specific terms, cross-referenced locations, dug into comment sections on posts that were years old. And slowly, across different platforms and different years, I started finding small pieces of things that fit together in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. A trip report from 8 years ago, posted on a hiking forum that looked like it had not been very active in years. From a solo hiker who had camped near a creek in Western Virginia and described waking up multiple nights to a smell he could not identify. Something he said was like wet earth, but wrong in a way he could not fully explain. He had attributed it to a nearby animal den and had not thought much more of it. The comment section had 2 replies. both suggesting it was probably a beaver lodge. A Reddit post from 5 years ago, short and casually written, from someone who had done a group camping trip in the same general region. They mentioned that one member of their group, a woman named Claire, had refused to sleep in her tent on the third night and had insisted on sleeping in the car at the trailhead parking area 1.5 miles away. The poster said Claire had not explained herself clearly, just said that something had been outside her tent the previous night and she was not willing to stay. The post was framed as a funny story about an overly anxious friend. The comments laughed along with it. I did not find it funny at all. A comment buried deep in a thread about Virginia wildlife from 3 years ago, left by a user whose account appeared to have been inactive since shortly after posting. The comment was a response to someone asking about unusual animal behavior in the Appalachian region. It said, and I am going to write it as closely as I can remember, because I did not think to screenshot it before the account went inactive and the comment became inaccessible. Something like, there are things in the older sections of those forests that wildlife biologists have not cataloged because the things in question are very good at not being cataloged. I spent 11 years doing field research in that region, and I have 3 incidents in my personal notes that I have never included in any official report because I have no framework for them that would survive peer review. If you spend enough time in those woods, you will have your own incident eventually. My advice is to pay attention to the quality of the silence. Pay attention to the quality of the silence. I read that line, and I sat back in my chair, and I thought about every moment on that trip when the forest had gone quiet in that specific heavy way. The way that was different from ordinary quiet. And I understood exactly what that person meant. There is a difference between a forest being quiet because it is peaceful and a forest being quiet because everything in it that knows better has decided to stop moving. And once you have felt the difference, you cannot unfeel it. It lives in your body as a separate category of experience, its own entry in the filing system your nervous system uses to sort the world into safe and not safe. I tried to find more information about the person who left that comment. The username gave me nothing. The account had been created, had posted a handful of comments about outdoor research and wildlife behavior over the course of a few months, and had then gone completely silent. I found one other comment from the same account, posted about 2 weeks before the one I had found, in response to a question about nocturnal animal behavior in highland forest environments. It said, "The most important thing I learned in 11 years of field work is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in ecosystems that have had thousands of years to develop things we have not thought to look for yet." I wrote that down in a notebook. I look at it sometimes. I sent the link to the buried comment to Derek. He read it and called me about 20 minutes later. We talked for a long time, longer than we had talked about the trip since the morning we sat in that diner with our eggs and coffee and tried to make sense of what we had seen. He asked me if I thought the field researcher had encountered the same thing we had. I said I thought it was possible. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that what bothered him about the comment was the number. 11 years of field research, 3 incidents in personal notes, 0 in official reports. He said that meant someone with professional training and scientific tools had spent over a decade in those forests and had come away with 3 experiences they could not explain and had chosen not to report any of them. Not because they had not happened, but because there was no framework that would survive peer review. I have thought about that phrase a lot. The idea that something can be real and witnessed and documented in private notes and still be effectively invisible, because the systems we have built for understanding the world do not have a place to put it. The thing we saw at the edge of the firelight does not have a place in any field guide or wildlife database or conservation report. It exists, if it exists, entirely outside the boundaries of what we have officially decided is possible in those forests. And it has apparently been existing there, quietly and carefully and patiently, for long enough that a professional researcher spent 11 years in its territory and collected 3 incidents and told no one. Derek asked me at the end of that phone call if I thought we were still being watched. I told him I did not know. He said he had been sleeping with his bedroom window locked since we got back, which he had never done before in the 15 years he had lived in his house. I told him I understood. I did not tell him that I had started doing the same thing, and that on certain nights when the air outside felt different in a way I could not explain, I lay awake in my locked apartment and thought about how good the thing in those woods was at not being seen, classic, and how far a patient and experienced thing might be willing to travel when it decided it was no longer just curious. I have no way of knowing if it stayed in those woods when we left. I have no way of knowing if it is still watching that creek, learning the next group of campers the way it learned us, or whether something about those 4 days changed its routine in some way I cannot predict. What I know is this. I know what I saw at the edge of the firelight. I know what Derek saw at the tree line on the night before that. I know what the mud on the opposite bank looked like on the first morning, and what the smell through my tent vents was like at 2 in the morning, and what the forest sounds like when everything in it that has good instincts has gone still all at once. Albert, I know the difference between a forest being peaceful and a forest holding its breath. And I know that somewhere in a stretch of old Virginia hills, in a part of the Appalachian woods that looks on a map like nothing more than an unremarkable green space between 2 county roads, there is something that has been there for a very long time. Something that does not appear in any official record. Something that is patient and large and careful and very, very good at staying exactly at the edge of what people are willing to believe. Something that watches. Something that waits. Something that has learned, over more years than I want to think about, exactly how close it can get before the people it is watching start to notice. And the only reason I am sitting here writing this tonight, the only reason I know any of this at all, is because on 1 night out of 4, it forgot to be still. Just for a moment. Just long enough.